Vitkoff-Rubio said that tremendous progress, that is significant progress, has been achieved in this negotiation process. But what is the reality? Let's break everything down step by step. Maxim Jihun, a political expert, will help us with this. He's already here in the studio with us. Thank you for this
discussion. Good to see you.
Maxim, so the main intrigue of the night is the appearance of the tapes featuring Vitkoff and Dmitriev, their conversations. In the context of two cases, the first is the preparation of a peace plan concept, 28 points. As it turned out, this plan was indeed written by the Russians. Then during the conversation between these two officials, it sounds like let's submit it as if it's from us, even though it was written by them. And the second case is about Vitkoff advising Dmitriev on how to approach Trump more gently, how to call him, how he needs to be praised in order to succeed in winning Trump over to their side ahead of his meeting with Zelensky. Thank you. How do you assess the timing of the release and the possible impact of these tapes on the attempt to find a format for a peace agreement?
It seems to me that this data leak will not have much impact on the further course, at least at this stage of the negotiations, because Trump has already stated that there is nothing strange here. What is there to talk about when we need to appease, to win over both sides? To bring them together, to unite them, these are things absolutely unrelated to real life, but nevertheless, that's the position. And it seems to me that in this triangle or polygon with a bunch of influence groups, both on the American side and the Russian side, and of course the Ukrainian position as well, there is a certain struggle within the American political groups. Why do I think that this leak is coming from the American side and not the Russian side? Because if the Russians had dared to do something like this, it would mean that a very loyal channel like Steve Witkoff's would simply be destroyed and would no longer function. But as a possibility of interdepartmental infighting within the American administration, especially a year before the elections, especially under conditions where there are several contenders to whom Trump would like to pass on this pedestal of presidential candidacy, it is now intensifying. And it seems to me that the key forces here are, on the one hand, Jay Divens, who is now sending his classmate, his friend, the US Army Minister Driscoll, to Kyiv and then to the Arab countries. On the other hand, there is also Vitkoff, who has long enjoyed a close friendship with the American president. There is, of course, Secretary of State Rubio, who is playing his own game and is actually one of the, probably the most powerful representatives of the state there. Because the rest are people who just came from the outside and are trying to build something. So I don't think he will have much influence on the negotiation process itself, because for the Ukrainians, it was not a surprise. You'll see that in 28 points, all that Russian propaganda and all the maximalist Russian demands are laid out in small portions. We have now worked through this plan. As a representative of the Ukrainian side said, and the Americans as well, there are a few minor but very important issues, meaning specific points, that still need to be agreed upon at the highest level. But that's not even the main point here. The point is that after it was handed over to Russia, as Bloomberg was already reporting yesterday, that they had reviewed it, they immediately rejected it. And it doesn't matter what that particular point was. In fact, it doesn't matter whether Ukraine would have agreed to it or not, whether Ukraine agreed to withdraw troops from Donetsk region or not. No matter what our proposals are, even if they're compromises, the Russians still won't like them. They'll definitely reject them because they'll say, listen, this doesn't align with the root causes of the war, which is what they always talk about. And Russia is carrying out a very clear task here. They want to drag out the moment as long as possible until the US president finally realizes, while the whole civilized world already knows, it's just that Trump can't be reached. That this is an attempt to delay the sanctions pressure, which could actually force Russia to reconsider its plans and objectives for this war.
And these influence groups you mentioned, the ones that might be fighting within the United States, who are these groups and what are their goals? How important is it for us to understand whether any of these influence groups genuinely want to help and support Ukraine, or is it purely internal squabbling? And here for us it's not worth looking for any benefit or harm.
She didn't know at all about that plan, which is basically a copy of Russian demands. And in fact, it's just a slightly rewritten version of the demands made by Ushakov and Dmitriev, which they stated in their phone conversation with each other. So, of course, it was Rubio who said that at first he basically didn't know about this plan, then said that these were Russian proposals, and then said that the Americans had made them. So it's obvious that he wasn't aware of it. And this means that he was not in direct contact with the Russians, and therefore he is not openly on their side. Now, speaking about Witkoff, for example, we understand that this is a person who came from the construction sector, who is a longtime friend of Trump, who has nothing to do with politics, with...
A businessman.
Well, yes, absolutely. He doesn't understand the political system, doesn't understand the mechanisms of checks and balances. So he's not a government representative. In other words, he thinks in terms of selling, buying, relocating, resettling, doing something along those lines. And to me, Vitkoff's role really reminds me of Medvedchuk's role in Ukraine back when, after the Minsk agreements, negotiations were taking place regarding prisoner exchanges. At that time, the Russians took a very tough stance, saying that nothing would happen, there would be no exchanges, we are very firm. But then, by chance, Medvedchuk appeared, who was on very good terms with the Russians, and he said, we can do everything, but the Russians are asking for a few points to be taken into account. And at that moment, it seemed like magic, as if there was a person who could persuade Putin, although in reality he was a planted agent carrying out specific functions in Ukraine. So now, understanding just how closely Vitkoff is connected to the Russian administration, with that same advisor Ushakov, who can give advice on how best to approach Trump, I get the feeling that he is an agent of Russian influence who, from within the American administration, helps the Russians to balance things and avoid those sanctions. Because Trump, despite his partial awareness of the situation, relies heavily on what his advisors, his assistants bring to him, and this is very dangerous, undoubtedly.
Is the US going to somehow upgrade this plan on its part? Oh, that's interesting, because I read in some analytics that Trump didn't even read through that peace plan with 28 points. Supposedly, he waited to see what Russia would propose now. Ukraine will work something out, and then he will decide how to proceed and what to do with it, how to play with it. As a Ukrainian, I personally found it unpleasant to hear Trump's words about Vitkoff trying to sell out Ukraine. These words were spoken on Air Force One, and it's very upsetting for every Ukrainian when our country is fighting for its independence thanks to our military. How will America act going forward?
I think it's no coincidence that the Americans have met several times with Ukrainian representatives. And as a result of long, difficult discussions, sometimes heated, as the media have reported, they nevertheless reached a compromise option for Ukraine, which may not fully satisfy us, but at least partially does. And this is what the joint position looks like now, because the Americans agreed, proposed something in response, and moved towards some kind of agreement. So it seems that this plan currently appears to be a consolidated version from both sides, including the American side. Again, the ball is in Russia's court, but in my opinion, their response is quite predictable. They will exert pressure, they will try to change the issues that are fundamental to them. And it's not even certain that after all sorts of lengthy manipulations, exchanges of opinions and adjustments, they will reach a common position that suits all three parties. That's why it seems to me the Americans are currently taking this position. The mediator in this story says, does this work for you? Well, okay, let's write it in.
Can China influence Russia in making a decision and signing this plan? Or does China no longer have such an influence on the Russian Federation, and has Russia broken free, slipped out of control? What do you think?
China, unfortunately or fortunately, influences many things not only in Russia but in principle around the world. It is the second largest economy, a country that keeps its hand on the throat of the US economy, that understands it has serious levers of influence and has such an authoritarian system where many things can be implemented manually. Therefore, of course, they have influence over the Russian Federation. And if he wanted to, Xi Jinping could create hellish conditions for Russia, after which it would realize that it simply has no more support in this war. The other thing is that China simply doesn't want to do this. And we have heard absolutely official statements that Xi Jinping is fully in favor of ending this war and starting a peace process. But to do that, it is necessary to neutralize the root causes of this war. In other words, this is currently a complete reiteration of the Russian position. What could happen on China's part, in my opinion, is communication between the US and China, as a result of which the US would offer China something that would make open support for the Russian Federation no longer relevant. I don't know whether this would be a matter of Taiwan or access for Chinese companies to the US market or something else. I think this could seriously make Xi Jinping consider at the very least freezing this war in its current state. Because let's remember, there's a principle that hasn't changed since the beginning of the full-scale invasion. China does not need a weak Russia bordering NATO for it to collapse and have some regime change happen there. They also don't need a Russia that's too strong. In other words, a smoldering, protracted conflict that allows them to use Russia simply as a raw materials base is ideal for them. But if they can reach some kind of compromise with the Americans, it could happen. But the question is, why would the Americans sacrifice any of their strategic interests just to end this war? I don't know if when you put the economic growth of the United States, Trump's rising ratings, and the Nobel Prize on the scales, the Nobel Peace Prize would win. That's why there are so many interests at play here and such a tangled web of calculations that it's very difficult to navigate and find a simple solution.
Today, we are officially moving into a new stage. In this negotiation process to find a peace agreement, Steve Witkoff is flying to Moscow, and to Ukraine is coming essentially a new special envoy for us, retired General Driscoll. Or is he not a retired general? Is he active?
Now, or not? Yes.
He's active. And we see that he has replaced Keith Kellogg, who has been removed from this process. This round is being conducted in this format. What will it be about?
I think the key task, once again, is for all the political groups within America to demonstrate who is more effective. Trump just let this whole story flow freely among his advisors and assistants.
And vice presidents. You negotiate, bring me concepts, and I'll review them.
I don't mind. His statement yesterday was that he's ready to meet with Zelensky and Putin, but only when the agreement is being signed or at its final stage. So basically, Trump doesn't really have the desire right now. He flew off to Mar-a-Lago. He doesn't plan to deal with politics these days. He's focused on golf. So it's Thanksgiving with turkey for a family dinner, and as for the rest, you sort it out among yourselves. And that's why it's clear that Driscoll is now representing Vance. Vance really dreams that in a year or two, Trump will say, here's the presidential flag, go ahead and run. I fully support you as the nominee. On the other hand, there's Rubio, as we know, who would also very much like to get that nomination. And then there's Witkoff, who without a doubt has his own business interests first and foremost, and he understands that he can't really gain any political dividends from this. So this is a battle of approaches which, however, I think are doomed in the sense that until the vision changes, until there is an understanding that pressure must be put on Russia, and that only through pressure can any concessions be achieved. We can keep formulating things differently, but it won't change the outcome. The number of points may increase or decrease, but in essence, this hasn't changed anything on a global scale.
Part of the answer to your question, Yevan, was actually mentioned at the beginning. I was surprised when it was said that Driscoll is from Jay Devon's team, that he's his friend, that they've been friends since their student years. And at that point, it became a bit clearer to me why he was the one sent to Ukraine and why the approach changed so drastically. Also, yesterday, there were secret negotiations in the United Arab Emirates, which turned out to be not so secret after all. There, Ukraine's chief intelligence officer, Budanov, met with a Russian intelligence officer. And why has the configuration changed? Why are intelligence officers meeting? And why Abu Dhabi? Why the United Arab Emirates?
You see, as it turned out, according to Western media reports, because we too are gathering whatever crumbs we can from this negotiating table and trying to piece together the bigger picture. Actually, the conversation was supposed to be about something else entirely. I don't think the head of the main intelligence directorate went there to coordinate any points of a plan, but obviously the conversation was supposed to be of a different nature. And clearly, intelligence officers don't really share such things, and they're right not to. But the fact that it coincided with Driscoll's arrival there and his negotiations obviously left some kind of mark. So I wouldn't place any overly high expectations that Ukraine is somehow conducting absolutely parallel talks there. A track that might be unexpected for Ukrainians, but even if Budanov was sent with such a purpose, I think the task here was to reinforce the main efforts and approach from a different angle. Because we understand that in every team there are their own groups of negotiators who can put pressure on different aspects of this negotiation process. We've talked about the Americans, and in Russia it's exactly the same story. Dmitriev is simply fighting for survival in political life. He doesn't hold any positions, he's not part of the inner circle. He simply needs to do everything he can right now to demonstrate results, to prove that he deserves a place in the sun. On the Ukrainian side, we also see that sometimes a combination of different players can yield different results from different angles. So why not use them? And
how does our domestic political, I don't know how to put it correctly,
Establishment.
A scandal or such a storm objectively affects the negotiation process? That is, we see the situation from our own perspective internally. How do you, as a specialist, see the real reaction of both Americans and Europeans to our internal scandalous developments?
Well, obviously, they are not very satisfied with what is happening there, with people who, without holding any official positions, are moving huge sums of money, and this story is not over yet. Clearly, this is a kind of warning bell that problems exist even during wartime. On the other hand, it is also true that Ukraine has at least managed to demonstrate this fact, and now there is a court case underway, with the investigation continuing. On the one hand, there is a problem, but on the other hand, the efforts of the United States to create an anti-corruption infrastructure are now showing practical results. As for Ukraine's position, I always say that the support for any president and any political system consists of two pillars, internal and external. When there is pressure from both sides, of course, this creates certain problems. But what seems to me to be the great strength of the Ukrainian people is that we can quarrel among ourselves here. I'm sure this story will continue to unfold. It will become much more intense than it is now, and there will be plenty of accusations, and some political processes will change as a result. But the fact is that under conditions where the international situation is so complicated right now, Ukrainians are ready to present a completely different vision on the international stage. Not to undermine any efforts there, but on the contrary, to understand that this is important. But also not to forget and not to stop feeling that a lot of effort needs to be made within the country.
And here it is important that these cases, those recordings, actually result in real verdicts, that all the information is confirmed, the evidence is collected properly, that the cases reach the courts, and that those responsible are indeed held accountable. It is also important for our international partners to see results.
I think Ukrainians will not allow this to just disappear or be covered up.